Palliser, Montana. The human body, after death, remains the legal and moral responsibility of its family, and the handling of that body from the moment of death through its final disposition is governed by a framework of law and professional ethics whose purpose is to ensure that the body is treated with the dignity that the family's grief requires and that the physical remains are accounted for completely and returned to the family or disposed of in the manner the family has chosen, without alteration or removal except as the family has specifically consented to. The medical examiner who investigates deaths for Palliser County had, for 24 years, operated in the space where that framework met the ordinary logistics of a rural Montana county, a space where bodies arrived at a small county facility on the edge of town were examined as the law required and were released to funeral homes for final care and disposition, and where the only person with full authority over the body in the interval between its arrival and its release was the county medical examiner himself, a man named Dr. Frederick Trask, whose competence had never been questioned and whose authority had never been checked, and whose private arrangement with the tissue procurement network operating out of an office park in Denver had, for 14 of his 24 years in the position, been generating an income stream that the county's annual financial disclosure filing did not contain, because Frederick Trask understood that the body's passage through his facility and what could be removed from it during that passage was visible only to him. The investigation that finally reached him in the fall of 2023 had its origins not in Palliser County but in a federal regulatory action against the Denver network itself, a proceeding by the Food and Drug Administration's Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research that had begun as a routine audit of tissue bank compliance records in early 2023 and had, over 9 months of expanding review, identified a pattern of procurement documentation irregularities consistent with tissue having been obtained without the legally required family consent. The network, which operated under the name Western States Tissue Alliance and which supplied processed connective tissue, corneas, bone, and skin grafts to hospitals and surgical centers -1 Western States, had procurement agreements with 11 source facilities across Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, of which 8 were licensed hospital pathology departments with compliance infrastructure adequate make the documented irregularities notable rather than systemic. 3 of the 11 were individual county medical examiner facilities in rural counties, of which the Palliser County facility, under Frederick Trask's directorship, was the largest by case volume. The FDS case agent on the audit, a woman named Sandra Yee, who had spent 8 years in the agency's Biologics Compliance Division and who had reviewed tissue bank documentation across 40 facilities in her career, described the Palliser County records in a memo to her supervisor as, technically speaking, among the cleanest she had seen, meaning they were comprehensive, consistently formatted, and they were internally also coherent. She wrote in the same memo, impossible to verify against any external record, because the consent documentation they contained referenced conversations between family members of decedents that had no corroborating paper trail, no witness signatures, no independent confirmation that the conversations had taken place as documented, and mechanism within the county medical examiner's record-keeping system by which a reviewer could confirm that the family members whose names appeared on the consent forms had actually provided the consent those forms described. She flagged this as a documentation integrity concern rather than a fraud allegation, a distinction that was procedurally important in an FDA audit context and that she honored, even as she understood, reviewing a decade of Trask's procurement records against the Western States Tissue Alliance's payment records for the same period, that the documentation's cleanliness and its unverifiability were almost certainly not independent. Clean and verifiable documentation is the signature of records that have been generated to satisfy an audit rather than to record an event. Sandra He had seen enough tissue procurement fraud in her career to know the signature when she read it, and the memo she wrote to her supervisor was not an accusation, but it was not either the memo of a person who expected her concern to be theoretical. The referral to the FBI's Denver field office came in September of 2023. The FBI assigned the case to a special agent named Thomas Carver who had spent 12 years working healthcare fraud cases and whose first call, after reading the FDA referral, was to the Montana Department of Justice, which had jurisdiction over the county medical examiner's conduct and which opened its own parallel investigation within 2 weeks. The two investigations ran concurrently and shared information under a formal coordination agreement, the FBI working the network side and the Montana DOJ working the county official side, until the two threads converged in November of 2023 on a search warrant for Frederick Trask's facility, his home office, and the Western States Tissue Alliance's procurement records in their entirety. Frederick Trask, the county medical examiner, had held his position since 1999, appointed by the Palliser County Commission after 7 years as a forensic pathologist at a hospital in Billings, where he had earned a reputation as a meticulous and thorough practitioner and where his departure for the county position had been noted by his colleagues as a loss, since county medical examiners in rural Montana tended to receive lower compensation and less professional stimulation than hospital pathologists, and the choice was unusual for someone at his career stage. He was 61 years old in 2023. He had, by every account of the law enforcement professionals, funeral home operators, and attorneys who had worked with him over his career, conducted himself with professional care in the performance of his publicly visible duties, which were the performance of autopsies, the certification of causes of death, and the maintenance of records adequate to support the legal proceedings that death investigations sometimes generated. What was not publicly visible was the back room of the facility, a processing area equipped beyond what standard county medical examiner operations required, whose equipment lists the search warrant team photographed and described in their evidence inventory as consistent with a tissue processing operation rather than an examination-only facility. The equipment had been purchased over a period of 9 years through a series of requisitions that the County Commission had approved as maintenance and capital improvement spending. Each request described in general terms that did not specify tissue processing equipment and that the Commission members who approved them did not have the clinical knowledge to recognize as something other than what they were described as. The network's payment records, obtained through the search warrant and through the FTAS audit cooperation, showed that Western States Tissue Alliance had paid Frederick Trask through a consulting agreement structured as professional development compensation for serving as the network's rural procurement advisor. A total of $640,000 across 14 years, an average of approximately $46,000 annually above his county salary, deposited in a personal account held at a bank in Billings in the name of Trask Professional Consulting LLC, a single-member entity that had filed appropriate tax returns every year because Frederick Trask was meticulous about his records in the ways that mattered to him. The tissue procurement record. The search warrant produced Frederick Trask's complete internal procurement records for 14 years, and the matching of those records against the county's official death investigation files was the task that the Montana DOJ's investigative team spent 3 months on, because it required going through more than 800 individual cases and, for each case, comparing the county file against the procurement file against the Western States Tissue Alliance's records against the funeral home's intake records, a 4-way comparison whose purpose was to establish, for each case where procurement had occurred, whether the family consent documentation was credible and whether the released body had been received by the funeral home in the condition consistent with the county's released documentation. The funeral home intake records were where the discrepancies first became concretely demonstrable rather than inferential, because funeral home directors are meticulous about the condition of bodies they receive for the obvious professional reason that the condition of the body determines the services they can offer the family, and the condition of the body at intake is documented in the intake record as a matter of standard practice. The investigative team's review of intake records from the 2 funeral homes in Palliser that handled the majority of the county's deaths identified 43 cases across 14 years, in which the funeral home's intake notation described a condition not fully explained by the certified cause of death and the standard autopsy procedures documented in the county file, a condition consistent in the assessment of 2 forensic pathologists retained by the DOJ to review the records, with tissue removal that the autopsy documentation did not disclose. The 43 cases were not the complete scope of the procurement because the intake records could only document the discrepancies that were visible at the funeral home's level of examination, and some tissue procurement leaves no externally visible sign. The DOJ's forensic pathologists estimated, based on the procurement payment records and the volume of material Western States Tissue Alliance had supplied from the Palliser account to its hospital and surgical center customers, that the total number of cases in which procurement had occurred without documented family consent was likely between 150 and 220 across the 14-year period, a range whose width reflected the limits of the available physical evidence rather than any uncertainty about the fact of the procurement. 150 to 220. The families. The victim notification process was, by every account of the people who designed and executed it, the hardest work any of them had done in their professional lives. The Montana DOJ's Victim Services Unit spent 2 months preparing the notification protocol in consultation with medical ethicists, grief counselors, and representatives from a national organization with families affected by tissue procurement fraud before sending the first letters in January of 2024 to the families of the 43 cases identified in the funeral home intake records, with a broader notification to the families of the estimated total affected cases to follow once the investigation had been made public. The protocol recognized from the beginning that there was no version of the letter that would not be a profound violation of something the family had believed about their loved one's body and about the institution that had handled it. The body had been in Trask's care. The family had trusted that care. What the letter told them was that the care had included something they had not been asked about and had not consented to, and that the physical remains they had buried or cremated or otherwise committed to a final resting place had been, before they received them, different in a specific and undisclosed way from what they had been before that difference was made. There is no frame in which that information is receivable without cost, and the cost is borne by the family, not by the notification process, not by the investigation, not by the criminal case, and not in any meaningful sense by Frederick Trask in his facility with his equipment and his consulting agreement, who has been separated from the consequences of what he did by every layer of institutional process that exists between a person who receives a letter and the person who made the letter necessary. The DOJ received 312 phone calls in the 2 weeks following the first public announcement of the investigation. The Victim Services Unit handled them with the resources it had, which were not adequate, and which it supplemented with contracted grief counseling services and with a hotline staffed by the Medical Ethics Organization. The calls varied enormously in their content and were consistent in the one thing they had in common, which was that the person on the other end of The line had loved someone whose body had passed through Frederick Trask's facility and who needed, in some form they could not always specify in advance, to understand what had happened to that body in the interval between the death and the funeral, and whether the thing they had buried was the person they had lost in the way that they needed it to be, which is without remainder, which is in the condition of dignity and wholeness that the law and professional ethics and the specific moral architecture of human grief all require, and that Frederick Trask had violated for 14 years in a back room in Palliser, Montana, for an average of $46,000 a year. The arrest. Frederick Trask was arrested at his home in Palliser on a February morning in 2024, charged with 43 counts of abuse of a corpse, the Montana statute applicable to the documented cases, 1 count of theft from the county for the equipment purchased under false pretenses, and 1 count of wire fraud in connection with the consulting payment arrangement. He was 62 years old. He surrendered without incident. His attorney issued a statement indicating that Dr. Trask would vigorously contest the charges. He was released on bond and remained in Palliser because there was no bail condition that required him to leave the community where he had worked for 24 years and where the families of the people whose bodies had passed through his facility lived, and where the 2 funeral home directors whose intake records had helped build the case drove past his house on the way to work. The Western States Tissue Alliance. The Denver network had its operating license suspended by the FDA in October of 2023, 3 months before Trask's founder arrest and chief operating officer, a man named Gerald Aka, who had operated similar networks into previous states under different corporate names before both were shut down under different circumstances, was charged federally with conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud, falsification, irregulated medical device records, and conspiracy to violate the National Organ Transplant Prohibition Acts on the sale of human tissue. Aka was 67 years old and had, in the 3 previous state-level actions against his organizations, always managed to avoid personal criminal charges by structuring the entities to absorb liability at the corporate level. He had not, this time, managed it, in part because Sandra Yee's audit had been thorough enough to follow the payment records to the level of individual procurement advisors, and in part because the FBI's investigation had produced email records between Aka and Trask that used language about consent documentation that Aka's attorney found very difficult to characterize as anything other than what it was, which was 2 men discussing the management of paperwork in a way that presupposed the paperwork was not a record of what had actually happened, but a document produced for the specific purpose of not being scrutinized too carefully. The consent forms. The DOJ's review of the consent documentation that Trask had produced over 14 years, cross-referenced against the available family contact records, identified 31 cases in which the member whose name appeared on a consent form was, for one of several verifiable reasons, likely not to have had the conversation that the form documented. 5 were families whose only contact address in Trask's records was an out-of-state address, and whose family members told investigators they had not traveled to Montana for the consent discussion the form described. 4 were families of decedents whose deaths had occurred during periods when the family member named on the form was, by their own account and by supporting records, in a medical facility themselves and not in a condition to receive or retain the specifics of a consent conversation. 22 were families who, when contacted directly, stated simply that they had never had a consent conversation with Frederick Trask about tissue donation, and that if he had asked, they would have remembered it, because it is not the kind of question a person forgets being asked. 22 families who said they would have remembered being asked The would is the most important word in that sentence because it is the word that distinguishes a consent process that failed from a consent process that was never attempted, and that establishes the moral character of what Trask did more completely than any statutory description of the charges against him. He did not ask. He made a form that said he had asked, and he filed it, and he processed the tissue, and he sent the body to the funeral home, and he received his consulting payment, and he did this for 14 years while the families came to collect their dead and took them home and buried them and did what families do in the years after that, which is grieve and remember. And in some cases, visit the cemetery and stand beside the grave and speak to the person in it, believing in the way that grief requires belief that the person in the grave is there, whole, in the way the family needs them to be, which they were not, in 43 documented cases and between 150 and 220 estimated cases, not because Frederick Trask had removed something that could not be returned, but because he had removed something without asking, and the asking was the thing, the asking was the threshold that separates tissue donation from tissue procurement and consent from absence of objection and a person's body from a resource, and he had not asked because asking would have reduced the volume, and the volume was the thing the consulting agreement was paying. F4. The trial date for State of Montana v. Frederick Trask was set for the fall of 2024. The federal case against Gerald Aka was proceeding separately in Denver. The tissue transplant recipients, the patients in 6 western states who had received tissue processed from Palliser County decedents, were notified through their treating physicians that the provenance of their implanted material was under investigation, a notification that the FDA required that the physicians delivered with the additional information, accurate and important, that the safety risk to the recipients was low because tissue processing sterilizes the material and the absence of proper donor consent is a legal and ethical violation rather than a pathogenic one. Low risk is not no risk, and the notification produced its own wave of responses from people who had received corneal transplants or bone grafts or skin grafts, and who now needed to understand what it meant that the material they carried in their bodies had come, possibly, from a person whose family had not been asked. There is no clean resolution to that question. The medical ethics guidance on the subject distinguishes between the safety of the tissue and the integrity of the consent process and says, correctly, that they are independent questions and that the answer to the safety question does not answer the integrity question, and that the integrity question is one that the legal and ethical frameworks governing tissue donation exist specifically did not tell him he was right. Asked because she did not tell him he was wrong. Has failed. In the 6 western states served by Western States Tissue Alliance, the framework had -1 in one county medical examiner's office for 14 years, and the people whose bodies passed through that office during those 14 years and whose families came to collect them and bury them and grieve them and visit their graves in the way that families do, were owed an asking that Frederick Trask decided was not worth the volume reduction it would have required, and the record of that decision and of what it cost is in the Montana DOJ archive and in the FDA audit files and in the federal court records in Denver and in the funeral home intake notations and in the 312 phone calls to the Victim Services Hotline and in the statement of every family member who said they would have remembered being asked, which is the statement that the record needed, and that the families gave, which is the only thing the families had to give that the record did not already contain, which is the specific and particular knowledge of what it means to love a person and lose them, and to have the institution responsible for the dignity of that loss decide that the dignity was negotiable for $46,000 a year in a back room in Palliser, Montana, that nobody was checking. The county commission hired a new medical examiner in March of 2024, a forensic pathologist named Dr. Agnes Lone, who came from a hospital practice in Great Falls and who accepted the position on the condition that the county would fund an independent oversight protocol for the facility, a protocol that included quarterly unannounced inventory audits of the facilities, equipment and materials, assigned attestation by any funeral home receiving remains from the facility that the body had been received in a condition consistent with the release, documentation, and a prohibition on any financial relationship between the medical examiner and tissue procurement or processing. The county commission agreed to all three conditions. The protocol was implemented before Dr. Lone took her first case. It will not be enough for every possible variation of what can go wrong in a county facility managed by one person. It is more than was there before. The bodies that pass through Palliser County's medical examiner facility now are accounted for completely in every record at every transfer point, with no interval in which the accountability belongs to one person alone. That is the minimum. It is new. It is what the case cost and what it bought for the families who are still in Palliser and for the bodies that are still passing through, which deserve the accounting they are now getting, which they were owed all along, which they are getting now. The funeral director, the investigation's most important internal witness, was not a family member and not a former colleague of Trask's, but a funeral director named Claire Austin, who had operated Austin Family Funeral Services in Palliser for 18 years and who had, over the course of those 18 years, developed the specific and finely calibrated professional knowledge of what a body received from the county medical examiner's facility should look and feel and present like, a knowledge built from 18 years of intake examinations and family preparation work and the kind of tactile familiarity with the recently deceased that funeral directors develop, whether or not they have a conceptual framework for what they are noticing. Claire had noticed things over the years that she had filed away under the explanation that county autopsies varied in their scope and that the ME's procedures were the ME's business, and that her business began when the body was released and the release documentation was in order. The release documentation had always been in order. She had a good professional relationship with Frederick Trask, or believed she did, which is the same thing in a small county where the medical examiner and the funeral director handle the same deaths from opposite ends and where the working relationship, when it is functional, produces a kind of collegial respect that is built on shared professional seriousness about a category of work that most of the rest of the world prefers not to think about. What changed her filing system was a case in the spring of 2022, 14 months before the FDA audit began and 18 months before the investigation's existence was public. The body of a man named Harold Wren, 73, who had died of cardiac causes at home, was released to her facility with documentation that she found standard in every respect and that she received in the standard way. In the course of preparation, she found a condition in the lower extremity tissue that she could not reconcile with the cardiac cause of death in the documentation, willing to carry, and a finding that was not decided in isolation, ceremony, alarming, and without but that she noted because particular moment of decision was meticulous to set down and leave where they left them. She later pulled it alongside for other similar notes she had made over the previous 6 years, produced a pattern she had not noticed at the individual case level, the same way that individual gate. Operation adjustments had not looked like a pattern until Renata Hollis put them in. Sequence. Claire did not call the DOJ or the FDA or the county commission. She called her state funeral director's assignations ethics hotline, described what she had found in the abstract terms that the hotline's standard intake protocol encouraged, and was connected 3 days later with the assignation's professional standards director, who understood immediately what the terms were describing and who referred her directly and with urgency to the Montana Department of Justice's Consumer Protection Division, which was not the right division for this case but was the right department, and which transferred her report to the Criminal Division within a week. Claire Austin's 6 notes and the 4-year span they covered were the first concrete, contemporaneous evidence that the investigation had access to when it opened its county-side inquiry, and the forensic pathologists who reviewed the Harold Wren case record and the 5 comparable cases alongside the Western States Tissue Alliance's procurement records were able, from that starting point, to establish the pattern that the full 14-year review subsequently confirmed in detail. Without Claire's 6 notes, the investigation would still have had Sandra Yee's audit findings and the payment records and the unverifiable consent documentation, but it would have taken considerably longer to establish the physical evidence of what had been done to specific bodies in a specific facility, and the additional months that process would have required might have been months in which Frederick Trask continued to work and continued to process and continued to file and continued to be paid. Claire Austin was asked in her formal investigative interview why she had kept the notes. She said that she kept notes on everything, that it was her practice to document observations that she did not have an explanation for, on the theory that the explanation might arrive later, and that the 6 notes had been sitting in her files for years, not because she had suspected anything, but because she had not been able to explain them and had not yet been able to stop wondering about them. She said she did not feel that she had done anything heroic, that she had simply done what her professional ethics required, which was to care for the bodies entrusted to her completely and to be honest about what she found in the course of that care, and that the two things together, the caring and the honesty, had produced a record that turned out to matter, which was not something she had planned and was not something she had credit for, because the credit belonged to the 18 years of professional practice that had made the notes automatic and the discomfort with unexplained findings too persistent to dismiss. She continues to operate Austin Family Funeral Services in Palliser. The county's new intake protocol requires her to sign a condition attestation for every body she receives from the county facility, a requirement she described to the county commission when they asked her about it in a public meeting as not burdensome, because she was already doing the examination that the attestation documents, and because the attestation creates a record that should have existed before and that she is glad to provide, and that the families of the people whose bodies passed through both facilities deserve to have in the record, which is a record of accountability at every point of transfer, which is what the handling of the dead requires and what Palliser County now has and did not have for 14 years while Frederick Trask's facility held the only record and Frederick Trask held the only key. What the families of the 43 families whose cases were documented in the intake records had, between them, a range of reactions to the investigation's findings that could not be compressed into a single description without losing the thing that the victim notification process had been designed to honor, which was the specificity of each family's relationship to the person They had lost and therefore to the violation the investigation had established. Some families said they needed to know everything and asked for the complete case record. Some said they needed to know nothing and said so in their first and only call to the hotline. Some asked specific questions about specific aspects of the procurement and received specific answers. To the extent the investigation's information allowed. Some said they wanted to speak to Frederick Trask directly and were told through the appropriate channels that this was not something the investigation could arrange, which was received differently depending on the family, with varying resources to frustration and varying urgency and the shared impatient grief of a person who has a question that the legal process cannot answer and that the person who could answer it has decided not to answer. A woman named Donna Keel, whose mother had died in 2016 and whose body had passed through Trask's facility, told the victim services coordinator that the question she most needed answered was not what had been taken, but whether her mother had known, meaning whether the moment of whatever procedure had occurred had been something that her mother, in whatever form of consciousness or its absence exists in that interval, had experienced as a violation, a question that the coordinator understood and could not answer, and that no one could answer, and that Donna had asked not because she expected an answer, but because she needed to have asked it to someone who understood why it was the right question, which it was, and which the coordinator told her, and which was the truest thing the investigation had available to give her in response to it. The questions that the families most needed answered were, in many cases, not the questions the investigation was designed to answer, because the investigation was designed to answer the legal and factual questions, and the questions the families most needed answered were the ones that the legal and factual answers made more acute rather than less. Not what was done, but what it meant, not the procedure, but the permission. Not the documentation, but the respect that the documentation was supposed to represent and did not. Those questions belong to the families and to the private accounting that families do. With the information the legal system provides, the long, unstructured, unbounded process of integrating into the story of a loss the knowledge that the loss included something that was not supposed to be part of it, something that the person in charge of the handling had decided was acceptable to add without asking for a consulting fee in a facility in Palliser, Montana, that the county had trusted to him. Because he was meticulous and thorough and because nobody had reason to question the equipment in the backroom or the payments in the billings account or the consent forms that the 22 families said they would have remembered being asked to sign. The 22 families are still in Montana, most of them. They visit the graves of the people they lost. They stand beside the graves and speak to them in the way that people speak to the dead, which is privately and without expectation of a response, which is the most honest conversation available once the investigation is over and the record is filed and the case is as resolved as it is going to be, which is legally but not fully, procedurally but not finally, in the way of all cases that the law can address and cannot close, because the closing belongs to the families and to the time that they are given, which is more than they wanted and less than they need and all that there is. Dr. Agnes Lond has been in the position for 6 months as of this accounts compilation. She has not identified any concerns in the facility's operations under the new protocol, which is expected and which is not the same as certainty but is the best available description of where the facility is, which is under oversight, which is Checked, which is accountable at every transfer point, which handles the bodies of Palliser. Counties dead with the care and the completeness that those bodies deserve, which is the minimum, which was not provided for 14 years, which is being provided now. In a facility in a small county in Montana where the only person who will ever again have sole access to the record of what passes through it is the record itself, which is open and which is complete and which will remain available to anyone who needs to read it for as long as records in this state are kept, which is long enough to outlast the case and the trial and the people whose names are in it, and to remain in the archive as the specific and permanent account of what happened in Palliser County when the oversight was absent, so that the absence and the presence that replaced it are both in the record together for as long as the record lasts. The national context. The Palliser County case was not the first prosecution of a medical examiner or autopsy facility for an authorized tissue procurement. It was, by the time it was filed, the most recent in a line
without resolution,
of cases stretching back to the early 2000s that had collectively produced a framework of federal and state regulation around tissue procurement that was considerably more rigorous than
Nadine Prater still
what
lives
had
in a house
existed
on
before
Claiborne
those
Road
cases,
where she and Roy,
that was still, as Palliser demonstrated, not sufficient to
She told
prevent
a
a
reporter in
determined
the
and
summer of
meticulous
2023
person from
that she didn't
operating
think
in
of
the gaps the framework had not closed. The gaps that Palliser exploited were specifically the gaps in rural county medical examiner oversight, the combination of geographic isolation, limited county resources for administrative review, professional deference that accrues to specialists in technical fields who have held their positions long enough to become the standard rather than the subject of oversight. Those gaps existed in 1999 when Trask was hired. They existed in 2009 when the procurement arrangement began. They existed in 2023 when the FDA audit started. They were not closed by any of the earlier cases because the earlier cases had involved different facility types and different mechanisms and had produced regulatory reforms to those mechanisms rather than to the county medical examiner model specifically. The National Association of Medical Examiners issued a statement in the months following Trask's arrest acknowledging that the case represented a failure of oversight at the county level and announcing a working group to develop guidance on procurement-related conflict of interest standards and audit practices for medical examiner facilities of all sizes. The working group's recommendations, issued in the spring of 2024, included a model disclosure policy requiring medical examiners to disclose and receive approval for any relationship with tissue procurement organizations, a quarterly facility audit standard that could be implemented even in county operations using existing state oversight infrastructure, and a best practice recommendation for independent from receiving funeral homes, the same practice that Claire Austin had been performing in her own way for 18 years and that the Palliser Protocol had formalized. The recommendations were advisory rather than mandatory, meaning their adoption by individual jurisdictions state-level regulatory action, and the pace of that adoption varied by state. As such, things always do, with the states that had experienced cases most recently moving fastest, and the states that had experienced no cases most recently moving slowest, which is the ordinary and maddening relationship between regulatory reform and the events that make it necessary, and which will eventually, in some state that has not yet had its Frederick Trask and does not yet feel urgency about the guidance document, produce another case in another county with another medical examiner whose expertise has never been questioned and whose back room has never been checked and whose consulting agreement is filed with a bank in the state capital and an account with a name that sounds like professional development, paying out for as long as the audit does not reach it, and the funeral director's notes have not yet accumulated to the number that makes the pattern visible. The note that started everything. Claire Austin's note about Harold Wren, the observation that she had made in the spring of 2022 and filed in her professional journal under the heading An Explained Finding, was transcribed as Exhibit 1 in the DOJ's case file, designated as such because it was the first contemporaneous physical evidence that the investigation had access to and because it represented, in the most concentrated form available, what the entire case ultimately rested on, which was a professional's willingness to notice a thing that her training told her was worth noticing, to write it down when she noticed it, and to be honest about it when the honesty became necessary. The note was 4 lines long. It was written in the professional shorthand that funeral directors use in their working notes, clinical and spare, describing a specific finding in clinical terms without any interpretive language, because at the time of writing, Claire Austin did not have an interpretation available and was not inventing one. She was simply describing what she found, the way her 18 years of professional practice had taught her to describe it, and filing the description in the place where she filed descriptions of things she did not yet understand, which was a professional habit she had developed because she was meticulous and because the work she did required her to be honest about what she observed even when she had no explanation for the observation. That habit, those 4 lines, are in the case file. They are Exhibit 1. They are dated April the 11th, 2022, 18 months before the investigation became public, 22 months before Frederick Trask was arrested. Between that date and the date of the arrest, he processed the tissue of several more decedents, received several more consulting payments, and continued to sign release that described the bodies as released in the condition consistent with the examination documentation, which they were not, which the 4 lines had already noted, and which the file will contain for as long as the file is open, which is permanently. Identity is built around in the state of Montana for criminal proceedings, which means the 4 lines will be in the archive after everyone whose name is in the file is gone, which is longer than Harold Wren will be remembered by anyone outside his family, and longer than Frederick Trask will be remembered outside the case law that his prosecution added to, and longer than Claire Austin will practice in Palliser, and longer than anyone now alive in Palliser County will live to see, and which is the way the record works, which is by outlasting the people in it, so that the account of what happened is available to anyone who needs to understand what a county medical examiner's facility in a rural county with no independent oversight and one determined and meticulous man can contain for 14 years before the right person does the right thing and writes the right 4 lines and files them in the right folder and calls the right number and says, when asked for, her name is Claire Austin. The name is in the record. The record is open. What the town knew. Palliser is a town of 4,000 people, a number that makes it large enough to have 2 competing diners and small enough for everyone to have formed an opinion about everyone else's business by the time the news of an arrest has been in the local paper for 24 hours. The announcement of Frederick Trask's arrest in February of 2024 was the largest local news event the paper had covered in a decade, and the weeks after the announcement produced the specific kind of community reckoning that small towns produce when a trusted figure is arrested, which is characterized by the same 2 impulses operating simultaneously in most residents: the impulse toward the disbelief that protects a community's self-image, and the impulse toward the private inventory of every interaction with the arrested person that might, in retrospect, have contained a sign. The signs that people recalled in conversations and in letters to the editor and in the extended discussions at the diner counters that constitute the public sphere of a town like Palliser were not the signs of a person in crisis or a person with visible behavioral anomalies. They were the signs that people always recall about the person in a trusted position who has turned out to be doing something in that position that the trust was not supposed to cover, which is to say they were not signs at all in any operational sense, but rather qualities that, read forward from 1999 to 2023, were simply the qualities of a meticulous and thorough professional, and that, read backward from the arrest, look to some people like the qualities of a person concealing something, because that is how backward reading works, and because backward reading is the thing that communities do after an arrest that serves the emotional purpose of feeling like they should have known, and the epistemic purpose of making the case seem more foreseeable than it was. It was not foreseeable. The structure that made it possible, the absence of any independent check on what occurred in a county facility between the arrival of a body and its release, was not specific to Palliser and was not a product of anything unusual about the community's relationship to its medical examiner. It was a product of how rural county medical examiner systems are designed, which is for efficiency and for the specific deference to professional expertise that a small county with limited administrative resources necessarily produces, and which had in this county, this facility, with this particular person in this particular chair for 24 years, produced the conditions that the investigation had found. The community was not at fault for trusting a public official with the authority that his position required. The community was the victim of a system whose design assumed the trustworthiness of the person it placed in the position rather than building in the verification that trustworthiness requires, and the community's retrospective reading of the signs does not change that. And the community knows this, in the way that communities know things they find uncomfortable, which is unevenly and with resistance and over time. Claire Austin's business has changed since the arrest, she has said, with the dry understatement of a person who has been in a difficult profession for 18 years and who does not dramatize the undramatic, that the families who come to her now sometimes ask questions they did not use.
Prosecute specific acts
To
committed by
ask
specific
questions
people,
about her
and the
intake
institutional
procedures
frame
and her
gives the
documentation
tools to
practices
do
and
that.
her relationship with
The
the
physical
county
frame
medical
is the one that
examiner's
lives in the
office
bodies of the
questions
people.
that she answers fully and without defensiveness, because the asking of them is the right response to the information that the community now has, and because the right response to having one's professional practices questioned by people who have recently learned that professional practices in this field can be violated without detection is to be as transparent as possible about what those practices are and how they work, and where the record is that confirms they are what you say they are. She is transparent. The record confirms it. The families take their time and ask their questions and, eventually, trust the process. Because the process is trustworthy, and because trustworthiness, once it has been demonstrated through transparency and documented through the independent oversight protocol, is not the same thing as the assumption of trustworthiness that had preceded it, and is more reliable, and is what the families of Palliser's dead deserve, and what the county's dead deserve, and what they are getting in the facility on the edge of town in every case completely. The facility on the edge of town. The Palliser County Medical Examiner's facility is a low, unremarkable building on the south edge of town, adjacent to the county's maintenance yard and visible from the highway. Before the exit ramp, a building whose exterior gives no indication of what occurs inside it beyond the county seal on the door and the hours posted in the front window. Dr. Agnes Loan's truck is usually in the parking area when the facility is open. The intake log is filed electronically now, with a copy going to the county administrator's office automatically. The quarterly auditor comes from Billings and parks in the lot and spends most of a day inside and files her report directly with the state. The release documentation goes to the receiving funeral home with Claire Austin's intake attestation attached before the file is closed. The building is the same building it was when Frederick Trask worked in it. The back room has the same dimensions it had when his equipment was in it. His equipment is gone, removed during the search warrant execution and cataloged in the evidence inventory and stored in the state's evidence facility pending the outcome of the criminal proceedings. The back room is now a standard storage area. Dr. Lone has said, when asked whether she finds the facility's history difficult to work in, that she finds it clarifying that working in a space whose history has been made fully visible by an investigation that did not spare any of the details is a specific kind of professional context that keeps the obligation of the work close to the surface rather than buried under the ordinary accumulation of routine. And that she is glad to have that specificity rather than a cleaner history. That would allow the obligation to feel less immediate, which is the honest answer of a person who understands what her facility is and what it is for, and what it failed to be for 14 years, and who has decided that the failure is part of the context in which she does her work, and that the context makes the work more serious and not less, and that serious is what she intends to be, every case in the building on the edge of town in a county that is watching now, and that deserves what it is being given, which is the accounting that was always owed. The Palliser paper ran a series of follow-up articles in the months after the arrest, each one adding a layer to the story that the initial coverage had not had time to reach. The most read of those articles, by a significant margin, was not the one about the arrest or the charges or the network or even the tissue recipients in 6 states. It was the one about Claire Austin, a short piece that ran without photographs at her request, and that described, in the plain and factual language that the town's weekly paper used for everything, the 4-line note and the professional habit that had produced it and the phone call that the note had eventually become. The piece did not editorialize. It described what had happened and left the meaning where it was, which was in the 4 lines and in the habit and in the phone call and in the 18 years that had built the habit, all of which were in the record and in the article and in the community's memory, sitting alongside everything else the case had added to the town's knowledge of itself, which was more than it had wanted and less than it could have been, and which is what knowledge is when it arrives the way it arrived in Palliser, which is late and necessary and the permanent. Record she stays complete for about an hour and then drives home, and the accounting is ongoing. The 4 lines are Exhibit 1,